David Mitchell had always preferred the quiet solitude of his lakeside cabin to the bustling chaos of city life. The rustic wooden structure sat nestled among towering pine trees on the eastern shore of Crystal Lake, a pristine body of water that stretched nearly 2 miles across and housed some of the most expensive waterfront properties in the county. What most people did not know, however, was that David owned not just his modest cabin, but the entire lake itself, along with the private access road that served as the only way in and out of the exclusive Lakeshore Heights community. The story began 3 generations earlier when David's great-grandfather Thomas Mitchell had purchased the entire area for practically nothing during the Great Depression. Back then, it was considered worthless swampland that nobody wanted. Thomas had been a shrewd businessman who saw potential where others saw only mosquitoes and murky water. He drained the swamp, built a dam, and created what would become Crystal Lake. Over the decades, the area transformed into prime real estate, but the Mitchell family had held on to their original deed, which included mineral rights, water rights, and most importantly, ownership of the private access road known as Lakeshore Drive. When David inherited the property 15 years ago, he had been a successful software engineer looking for a peaceful retreat from his high-stress job in Seattle. He renovated the old cabin, keeping its rustic charm while adding modern amenities, like solar panels, high-speed internet, and a state-of-the-art water filtration system. He worked remotely most of the time and found the tranquil environment perfect for both his professional responsibilities and personal well-being. The problems began when Lakeshore Heights was developed 5 years ago. A group of wealthy investors purchased several parcels around the lake and built massive custom homes, each worth several $1,000,000. They established the Lakeshore Heights Homeowners Association to maintain property values and ensure the exclusive nature of their community. What they did not realize was that their entire development depended on an access road that belonged to someone else. Margaret Williams served as the HOA president, and she embodied everything David disliked about entitled wealthy people. She was a former corporate lawyer who had retired early thanks to her husband's successful investment firm. Margaret lived in the largest house on the lake, a sprawling 10,000 square foot mansion with perfectly manicured grounds and a private boat dock. From the moment she moved in, she had viewed David's modest cabin as an eyesore that diminished the value and prestige of their exclusive community. The first confrontation occurred on a crisp October morning when David was enjoying his coffee on his front porch. Margaret had marched up his driveway wearing an expensive designer suit and carrying a leather briefcase filled with official-looking documents. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her cold blue eyes radiated disapproval as she surveyed his property. "Good morning," she said, though her tone suggested it was anything but good. "I am Margaret Williams, president of the Lakeshore Heights Homeowners Association, and we need to discuss your property situation." David set down his coffee mug and regarded her with mild curiosity. "What situation would that be?" Margaret opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "Your cabin is in violation of multiple community standards, and we are prepared to take legal action if necessary. The architectural guidelines clearly state that all structures must meet certain aesthetic requirements, and your property falls far short of those standards." David could not help but smile. The architectural guidelines for what community exactly? For Lakeshore Heights, of course, Margaret replied as if speaking to a particularly slow child. "Your property is located within our community boundaries and therefore subject to our regulations and fees." "That is interesting," David said, leaning back in his chair, "because I was not aware that I had joined any homeowners association. When exactly did I agreed to these regulations?" Margaret's expression hardened. "You do not get to choose, Mr. Mitchell. Property ownership comes with responsibilities, and your cabin is dragging down property values for the entire lake. You either bring it up to our standards, or we will pursue legal remedies." David stood up and walked to the edge of his porch. "Let me understand this correctly. You moved into a neighborhood next to my cabin, which has been here for decades, and now you want me to change it to suit your preferences." "It's not about preferences," Margaret snapped. "It is about maintaining the quality and value of our community. Your ramshackle cabin looks like something out of the 1950s. Actually, it was built in 1947, David said calmly, "and it has been continuously maintained and improved ever since." Margaret pulled out another document. We have prepared a list of required improvements to bring your property into compliance. The estimated cost is approximately $200,000. You have 60 days to complete the work or face eviction proceedings. Took the paper and glanced at it briefly. New siding, professional landscaping, architectural lighting, a 3-car garage and a boathouse, among other items. He looked back at Margaret with amusement. Eviction proceedings. Based on what authority? The Lakeshore Heights Homeowners Association has full authority to enforce community standards, Margaret declared. We have already consulted with our attorney, and your property clearly falls under our jurisdiction. David folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket. I think you should consult with your attorney again, Margaret. And while you are at it, you might want to ask him to research property deeds and easement rights. What are you talking about? Margaret demanded. David smiled. Nothing important, just a suggestion. Have a good day, as. Margaret stormed back down his driveway. David could not shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He had dealt with difficult clients and unreasonable demands throughout his career, but something about Margaret's arrogance and sense of entitlement bothered him more than usual. Perhaps it was because she was threatening his peaceful sanctuary. Or maybe it was her assumption that money and expensive lawyers could override legal property rights. That evening, David called his attorney, James Park, who had handled the estate transfer when he inherited the cabin. James was a laid-back guy who specialized in real estate law and had grown up in the area, so he understood the local dynamics and politics. Jim, David said when his lawyer answered the phone, I just had an interesting visit from the president of the Lakeshore Heights. Oh, no, James replied with a chuckle. What did Margaret Williams want this time? This time, David asked. She has been making noise about various properties around the lake for the past couple of years. James explained. She thinks she can turn the entire area into some kind of exclusive, gated community. Well, she just threatened to evict me from my own property. If I do not spend $200,000 upgrading my cabin to meet their architectural standards. James was quiet for a moment. That is a new one even for Margaret. She has no legal authority to make demands like that. Your property predates their HOA by decades, and you never agreed to join that, is what I figured, David said. But I have a feeling she is not going to give up Isalee. Probably not, James, agreed Margaret. Williams is not used to hearing the word no. Do you want me to send her? A cease and desist letter? Not yet, David replied. I'm curious to see how far she is willing to push this. 3 weeks later, David received a certified letter from the law firm of Henderson Barrett and Associates. It was a formal notice of violation and demand for compliance. The letter repeated the same demands as Margaret's visit, but with more legal language and threats of litigation. If the requirements were not met within 30 days, David forwarded the letter to James, who called him back. Within an hour, these people are completely delusional. James said, you should see the letterhead on this law firm. They charge $800 an hour, and they are threatening to sue you for not joining an HOA you never agreed to join. What do you think they will do next? David asked honestly. I have no idea, James replied. In 20 years of practicing real estate law, I have never seen anything quite this brazen. They seem to genuinely believe they have authority over your property to days. Later, David got his answer. Margaret Williams returned to his cabin, but this time she was not alone. She brought 2 other HOA board members, Robert Chen, who owned the second largest house on the lake, and Patricia Martinez, who served as the HOA treasurer. They also brought a surveyor and a photographer who immediately began taking pictures of David's cabin and measuring his property lines. David watched from his kitchen window as the group spent nearly an hour documenting every detail of his property. Margaret pointed at various features while making notes, and the surveyor used his equipment to establish precise boundaries. The photographer took dozens of pictures from multiple angles, capturing everything from his solar panels to his modest garden. When they finished their documentation, Margaret knocked on his front door. David considered ignoring her, but decided he was curious about their latest scheme. Mr. Mitchell, Margaret said when he opened the door. We have completed our property assessment, and the situation is even worse than we initially thought. Worse? How? David asked. Cabin is not only in violation of architectural standards, but it also encroaches on common area property. Margaret declared. Your garden and your parking area extend beyond your legal property boundaries. David raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Our surveyor has confirmed that approximately 1/4 of your developed land is actually community property that belongs to the Lakeshore Heights. Homeowners Association, Margaret continued. You were essentially squatting on our land, David looked past Margaret to the surveyor who was packing up his equipment. That is very interesting. Did your surveyor happen to research the original property deeds before making that determination? Of course, Margaret replied indignantly. We are not amateurs. Mr. Mitchell, David nodded thoughtfully. In that case, your surveyor should be able to tell you who owns Lakeshore Drive. What does that have to do with anything? Margaret asked. Well, if I am encroaching on your property by a few feet, then presumably you want to be very precise about property boundaries, David said. And since we are being so careful about boundaries, I thought you might be interested to know who actually owns the road you drove in on. Margaret's confident expression flickered slightly. What are you talking about? Lakeshore Drive, David said. The private road that provides the only access to all the houses in your community, including yours. Who do you think owns it? That is obviously community property, Margaret replied, though she sounded less certain than before. Actually, David said, it belongs to me along with the lake itself and all the water rights. You are lying, Margaret declared. David shrugged. Feel free to check the county records. The original deed is quite clear. As the group drove away, David noticed that Margaret was on her phone, presumably calling her expensive attorney. He suspected that the next few days would be very interesting. James called him that afternoon, laughing so hard he could barely speak. David, you are not going to believe this, he said. I just got a call from Henderson, Barrett and Associates. They want to set up a meeting to discuss property boundaries. What? Did you tell them? David asked. Ty told them to review the county records first and call me back when they understand what they are dealing with, James replied. The junior associate who called me sounded like he was about to have a panic attack. 3 days later, Margaret Williams called David directly. Her tone was completely different from their previous interactions. Mr. Mitchell, she said carefully, I think there may have been some misunderstandings about the property situation around the lake. What kind of misunderstandings? David asked. Well, it appears that the ownership structure is more complicated than we initially realized, Margaret replied. Would you be willing to meet with our board to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement, David? Considered the request what kind of arrangement we would like to discuss purchasing certain property rights from you, Margaret said. Perhaps we could work out an agreement that benefits everyone involved. David found this interesting. What rights specifically? Well, the access road, for example, Margaret said. We understand that you technically own Lakeshore Drive and we would be interested in purchasing an easement, or perhaps buying the road outright. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Margaret dancing around the real issue. She clearly understood now that her community was entirely dependent on David's goodwill for basic access, but she was not quite ready to admit how badly she had miscalculated the situation. David agreed to meet with the HOA board the following Saturday, but only at his cabin. He wanted the discussion to take place on his own turf, where he felt most comfortable. The board agreed, though Margaret sounded reluctant about the arrangement. Saturday morning arrived, gray and drizzly with low clouds hanging over the lake. David made a pot of coffee and waited on his front porch as the HOA board members arrived. Margaret came first, followed by Robert Chen and Patricia Martinez. They were joined by a fourth person David had not met before, an elderly man in an expensive suit who was introduced as Howard Barrett, senior partner at Henderson, Barrett and Associates. The group settled around David's outdoor table, and Margaret attempted to take charge of the meeting. Mr. Mitchell, she began, we appreciate you taking the time to discuss this situation. We believe there is a path forward that works for everyone. David poured coffee for everyone and waited for her to continue after consulting with our attorney. Margaret said, gesturing to Howard Barrett, we understand that there are some complex property ownership issues that need to be resolved. Complex is one way to put it. David agreed. What we would like to propose, Margaret continued, is a reasonable agreement that grants the Lakeshore Heights community permanent access rights to our properties in exchange for appropriate compensation. And what would you consider appropriate compensation? David asked. We prepared to offer $50,000 for a permanent easement allowing community use of Lakeshore Drive, Margaret said. David sipped his coffee and looked out at the lake. $50,000. That is interesting. What would happen if I declined that offer? Howard Barrett interjected in a pompous tone. I think we need to consider the legal obligations that come with property ownership. Mr. Mitchell, you cannot simply block access to an entire community. Actually, David replied. I think you will find that I can. The road is private property, and I have not granted any easements, but have allowed access for years. Barrett argued that creates an implied easement under state law. David looked at the attorney with amusement. Half residents of Lakeshore. It's been paying me for road maintenance all these years. No, Barrett admitted. Have they contributed to snow removal or repairs? David continued. No, have they even asked permission to use the road? David asked. Barrett shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Well, no, but then there is no implied easement, David said calmly. Occasional tolerance of trespassing does not create legal rights. Conversation continued for another hour with the HOA. Representatives gradually realizing how precarious their situation truly was. Not only did David own their only access road, but he also owned the lake itself, including all water rights. That meant he could theoretically cut off their water access, charge them for boat dock permits, or even drain the lake if he chose to do so. Margaret's demeanor grew increasingly desperate as the full scope of their vulnerability became clear. Surely you do not intend to cut off access to our homes, she said. There are families living here, children, elderly residents. It would be unconscionable. David leaned back in his chair. I have no intention of cutting off access, Margaret, but I also have no intention of being bullied into spending $200,000 renovating my cabin to meet your arbitrary standards. What if we dropped the architectural requirements? Margaret asked quickly. Would you consider that? David shook his head. The architectural requirements were never valid to begin with. You have no authority over my property, Margaret. None whatsoever. Howard Barrett tried a different approach. Mr. Mitchell, while you may technically own the access road, I think you will find that blocking community access would create significant legal liability. Homeowners purchase their properties with the reasonable expectation of continued access, and I suppose those homeowners did their due diligence before purchasing, David replied. They researched property deeds, easements, and access rights before spending millions of dollars on lakefront homes. Barrett said nothing because if they had done proper research, David continued, they would have discovered that their access depends entirely on the goodwill of someone they have been trying to evict from his own property. The meeting ended with no resolution. Margaret and her board members left looking shell-shocked, while Howard Barrett promised to research the situation further and get back to David within a week. David suspected that the attorney's research would only confirm what they had already learned, that the Lakeshore Heights community had built their exclusive development on a foundation of legal quicksand. Over the next few days, David noticed increased activity around the lake. Several homeowners came by his cabin, attempting to introduce themselves and strike up friendly conversations. It was obvious that word had spread about the property ownership situation, and people were beginning to worry about their investments. Tom Richards, who owned a $4 million house directly across the lake, stopped by on Tuesday morning with a basket of expensive wine and gourmet snacks. I hope you do not mind the intrusion, Tom said when David answered his door. I wanted to introduce myself and welcome you to the neighborhood. David accepted the gift basket, though he found the timing suspicious. I have lived here for 15 years, Tom, but thank you for the thought. Tom laughed nervously. Right? Of course, I just meant welcome to our little community here. We are all very friendly neighbors. Is that so? David asked. Oh, absolutely, Tom replied. We look out for each other, help with maintenance issues, that sort of thing. In fact, if you ever need any work done on your cabin, I know some excellent contractors. David wondered if Tom knew about the $200,000 renovation demands. That is very generous. What kind of work did you have in mind? Well, Tom said, gesturing vaguely, your place has such great character, very authentic rustic charm. You know, some of us have been thinking that maybe our architectural guidelines are a bit too restrictive. That is interesting, David said. Did Margaret Williams share that opinion? Smile became even more strained. I think Margaret is coming around to a more flexible approach. She realizes that diversity in architectural styles can actually enhance property values. David nodded. That is quite a change of heart. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with Tom dancing around the real reason for his visit. He clearly wanted to gauge David's intentions regarding road access, but was too polite. Thursday brought another visitor, Linda Foster. An elderly woman who lived in a modest house by Lakeshore Heights standards at only $3 million. She seemed genuinely distressed about the situation and took a more direct approach than Tom. "Had Mr. Mitchell," she said when David invited her in for coffee, "I hope you do not mind me being blunt, but I am very worried about what is happening with the Homeowners Association." "What specifically are you worried about?" David asked. "Well," Linda replied, "I heard that there might be some kind of dispute about the access road. Is it true that you own Lakeshore Drive?" David confirmed. Linda looked stricken. "What does that mean for those of us who live here?" "That depends," David said, "on whether the HOA wants to continue threatening me with eviction, or if they prefer to find a more reasonable approach." Had no idea about any eviction threats. Linda said Margaret never mentioned that at board meetings. She just said there were some property maintenance issues that needed to be addressed. David poured her more coffee. "Margaret Williams tried to force me to spend $200,000 upgrading my cabin and threatened legal action if I refused. She also claimed I was encroaching on community property and demanded that I remove parts of my garden." "That is terrible," Linda said. "I am so sorry. I had no idea the situation was so adversarial." David appreciated Linda's genuine concern and found himself feeling sympathetic toward her. She seemed like a decent person who had gotten caught up in Margaret Williams' power games through no fault of her own. "Do not worry about it, Linda," David said. "I am not interested in punishing innocent homeowners for their HOA president's bad behavior." "Can we do to resolve this?" Linda asked. "The solution is actually quite simple," David replied. "The HOA needs to stop making illegal demands and start treating people with basic respect. Beyond that, I am open to reasonable discussions." "About access agreements?" Linda left looking somewhat relieved, but David suspected that his message would get garbled by the time it reached Margaret Williams. Sure enough, Margaret called him that evening, sounding more aggressive than ever. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "I understand you have been having conversations with our homeowners behind the board's back." "Behind your back," David repeated. "I have been talking to my neighbors, Margaret. Some of them actually seem like decent people. You cannot divide our community by making private deals with individual homeowners." Margaret declared any agreements need to go through the proper channels. "What proper channels would those be?" David asked. "The same channels you used when you tried to evict me from my own property." "That is completely different," Margaret protested. "How is it different?" David asked. "Because I am the HOA president," Margaret said, as if that explained everything. "I have fiduciary responsibilities to protect property values and maintain community standards, and I have property rights," David replied, "including the right not to be harassed by people who think expensive lawyers can override legal deeds." Though conversation quickly devolved into the same circular arguments they had been having for weeks, Margaret could not seem to grasp that her position as HOA president gave her no authority over David's property, while David grew increasingly frustrated with her refusal to acknowledge basic legal reality. Friday brought the most interesting development yet. David was working in his garden when he noticed a small convoy of vehicles turning onto Lakeshore Drive. A black sedan, followed by two SUVs, drove slowly toward the community. Clearly lost the lead vehicle, stopped near David's cabin, and the driver rolled down his window. "Excuse me," the man called out. "We are looking for the Lakeshore Heights sales office. You know where that might be?" David walked over to the car. "There is no sales office here. This is a private residential community." The man looked confused. "But we have an appointment to view available properties. Our real estate agent told us to meet her at the community entrance." David looked at the other vehicles and noticed they were all luxury cars with out-of-state license plates. "I think there has been some kind of mistake. There are no properties for sale in Lakeshore Heights as far as I know." The man showed David a business card from Premium Lakefront Properties and an appointment confirmation for a showing at Lakeshore Heights. "What about that house over there?" he asked, pointing to Margaret Williams' mansion that belongs to the HOA president. David said, "And I am quite certain it is not for sale." Just then Margaret's car came racing down Lakeshore Drive. She pulled up next to the convoy and jumped out looking panicked. "Gentlemen," she called out, "I am so sorry for the confusion. There has been a scheduling error." The lead driver got out of his car. "We drove for hours for this appointment," he said sternly. "Our client is flying in from California specifically to see these properties." Margaret shot a nervous glance at David. "There has been a misunderstanding about property access," she said. We need to reschedule for next week. What kind of misunderstanding? The man asked. Well, Margaret said, still looking at David, it appears that our community access road is owned by a private individual, and there are some legal complications that need to be resolved. The real estate agents looked confused and annoyed while David began. To understand what was happening, Margaret was clearly trying to sell properties in Lakeshore Heights without disclosing the access road situation to potential buyers. That was not only unethical, but potentially illegal. After the convoy left, Margaret approached David, looking more defeated than he had ever seen her. How long have you been showing properties to buyers without telling them about the road situation? David asked. I have not been showing anything, Margaret replied defensively. Premium lakefront properties contacted me about potential listings. Potential listings, David repeated. So you were planning to sell your house without mentioning that the new owners would be entirely dependent on my goodwill for access? That is not how I would phrase it, Margaret said. How would you phrase it? David asked. It is a minor technical issue that can be resolved through proper legal channels. Margaret replied. Minor technical issue? David shook his head. Margaret, you built your entire community on someone else's private road, and now you are trying to sell properties without disclosing that fact to buyers? Do you have any idea how much legal trouble you could be in? Margaret's face went pale. What do you mean? David looked at her with something approaching pity. Have you even consulted with a real estate attorney about disclosure requirements? Someone buys a multi-million-dollar house from you and then discovers they have no guaranteed access. They're going to sue you into bankruptcy. Need to make some phone calls, Margaret said hurriedly. I think that would be wise, David agreed. That weekend, David received another visit from Howard Barrett. But this time, the attorney came alone and looked considerably less confident than he had. During the board meeting, Mr. Mitchell Barrett said, I wonder if we could have a private conversation about the access road situation. Of course. David replied, Would you like some coffee? Barrett accepted the offer, and they sat on David's front porch. Overlooking the lake. I have spent the past week researching your property deeds, Barrett began, and I have to admit that your legal position is much stronger than I initially realized. David waited for him to continue. The original Mitchell family deed clearly includes ownership of the access road and the lake itself. Barrett said there are no recorded easements granting public or community access. That is correct. David agreed. Barrett was quiet for a moment. Mr. Mitchell, I think I need to be frank with you. The Lakeshore Heights Homeowners Association is in serious legal jeopardy. How so? David asked, though he already knew the answer. Several homeowners are threatening to sue the HOA for failing to disclose the access road situation before they purchase their properties. Barrett explained the potential damages could be in the tens of millions of dollars. David sipped his coffee. That does sound serious. Barrett leaned forward. Mr. Mitchell, I am going to be completely honest with you, Margaret. Williams made serious errors in judgment. She should never have threatened you with eviction, and she definitely should not have tried to claim authority over your property. David appreciated the attorney's candor. What are you suggesting? I think the HOA needs to make this right, Barrett said. We need to negotiate a fair access agreement, and Margaret Williams needs to resign as president. Those sound like reasonable first steps. David agreed. What did you have in mind for an access agreement? Barrett pulled out a folder. I have drafted a proposed easement agreement that grants permanent access rights to current homeowners in good standing. The HOA would pay you $50,000 up front, plus $5,000 annually for road maintenance. David reviewed the document. It is a start, but there are some issues we need to address, such as Barrett asked. First, the upfront payment needs to be higher. David said this road serves a community with over $30 million in property values. $50,000 is insulting. What would you consider fair? Barrett asked. $250,000, David replied. Plus the annual maintenance fee should be $10,000. Barrett winced, but nodded. I think we can work with those numbers. What else, Margaret? Williams needs to publicly apologize for her threats and harassment, David continued. And the HOA needs to acknowledge in writing that they have no authority over my property. Done. Barrett agreed. What else any future development in the area needs? My approval, David said. I will not allow someone to build another community that depends on my road without consulting me first. Barrett made notes that might be more difficult to info. Finally, David said, I want a clause stating that if the HOA ever again tries to claim authority over my property or threatens me with legal action, the access agreement becomes null and void." Barrett looked up sharply. "That seems rather harsh, David." Met his gaze, Howard the first tried to ignore Margaret's threats and harassment for months. "I offered to discuss things reasonably, and she responded by bringing surveyors and photographers to document violations on my own property. She created this mess. Through arrogance and bullying now, she gets to live with the consequences." Barrett sighed. "You are right, of course." Negotiation continued for another hour as they worked through the details of the access agreement. Barrett proved to be much more reasonable than his client, and David found himself respecting the attorney's straightforward approach. When they finished, Barrett promised to present the terms to the HOA board within 48 hours Tuesday evening. Margaret Williams called David, sounding completely defeated. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "we accept your terms for the access agreement." "All of them?" David asked. Or Margaret replied. "The board voted unanimously to approve the agreement." "What about your resignation?" David asked. "That will be effective immediately," Margaret said. "I will submit my resignation letter tomorrow morning." David found no satisfaction in Margaret's defeat. She had brought this situation on herself through arrogance and poor judgment, but he took no pleasure in watching someone's life fall apart, even someone who had tried to make his life miserable. Access agreement was signed the following Friday with Linda Foster serving as the new interim HOA president. She was everything Margaret was not: humble, reasonable, and genuinely interested in building a harmonious community. David found her much easier to work with and suspected that the other homeowners would as well. As part of the agreement, Margaret Williams issued a public apology to David and the homeowners for her mishandling of the situation. She also agreed to cover all legal fees associated with resolving the access road issue. The final cost to Margaret personally was over $100,000, a steep price for her attempt to bully someone off his own property. 6 months later, David's life had returned to its peaceful routine. The new HOA board under Linda Foster's leadership proved to be respectful neighbors who understood the value of maintaining good relationships. Margaret Williams had moved away after selling her mansion at a significant loss. The disclosure requirements about the access road situation had scared off several potential buyers, and she ultimately accepted an offer well below her asking price. David used the $250,000 easement payment to make some genuine improvements to his cabin, including a new roof, solar panel upgrades, and a small addition that housed a proper home office. He also hired a landscaping company to create a beautiful garden that complemented the natural beauty of the lakefront setting. The improvements increased his property value significantly while maintaining the rustic character. He loved the annual maintenance payments allowed David to keep Lakeshore Drive in excellent condition. He hired a local contractor to repave sections of the road, install proper drainage, and add safety features, reflective markers, and improved signage. The homeowners were impressed with the improvements, and several commented that the road had never been in better condition. Linda Foster proved to be an excellent HOA president who focused on practical issues like road maintenance, community events, and environmental protection rather than arbitrary aesthetic requirements. She organized quarterly community meetings that David actually enjoyed attending and established committees to address legitimate concerns like lake water quality and wildfire prevention. Other homeowners gradually warmed up to David once they realized he was a reasonable person who simply wanted to be left alone. Tom Richards became a genuine friend who often stopped by to chat about fishing and local wildlife. Linda Foster invited David to serve on the Environmental Protection Committee, where his technical background proved valuable for evaluating water quality reports and conservation proposals. David also developed an unexpected friendship with Robert Chen, who turned out to be a retired engineer with a passion for renewable energy. They collaborated on a community-wide solar initiative that reduced everyone's electrical costs while minimizing environmental impact. The project was so successful that it attracted attention from county officials who used it as a model for other rural developments. Perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the change in community culture under Margaret Williams' leadership. The HOA had been focused on exclusivity status and rigid control of property aesthetics. Linda Foster's approach emphasized cooperation, environmental stewardship, and respect for individual property rights. The shift created a much more pleasant living environment for everyone involved. David often reflected on the lessons learned from his confrontation with the HOA. Most important was that bullying and intimidation tactics usually backfire when used against people who understand their rights and are willing to stand up for themselves. Margaret Williams had assumed that her wealth, social status, and expensive lawyers would allow her to override basic property law. She learned the hard way that legal rights trump social pretensions every time. Another key lesson was the importance of doing proper research before making major decisions. If the Lakeshore Heights developers had investigated property deeds and easement rights before building their community, they could have negotiated a fair access agreement from the beginning. Instead, their failure to understand the legal landscape created years of uncertainty and ultimately cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees and settlement payments. David also learned that most people are reasonable when approached with respect and honesty. The individual homeowners in Lakeshore Heights turned out to be decent people who simply wanted to enjoy their lakefront properties in peace. They had been misled by their HOA president into believing that David was somehow threatening their property values when in reality he just wanted to be left alone. The experience reinforced David's belief that the best way to handle bullies is to remain calm, understand your rights, and refuse to be intimidated. Margaret Williams had tried every trick in the book, from legal threats to social pressure to manufactured property disputes, but because David knew exactly where he stood legally and was willing to defend his position, she ultimately had no choice but to back down too. Years after the original confrontation, David received a letter from Margaret Williams. It was a handwritten note apologizing for her behavior and thanking him for not pursuing legal action against her personally. She had moved to Arizona, where she was volunteering with a nonprofit organization that helped seniors navigate property law issues. The irony was not lost on David that Margaret had found redemption by helping other people understand the same legal principles she had tried to ignore. David wrote back, wishing her well in her new endeavors, and expressing hope that her experiences in Lakeshore Heights had taught her valuable lessons about respecting other people's rights. The exchange reminded him that even the most difficult people are capable of growth and change when they face the consequences of their actions. Today, David continues to enjoy his peaceful life at Crystal Lake. The community around him has evolved into exactly what it should have been from the beginning: a group of neighbors who respect each other's property rights, work together on common concerns, and appreciate the natural beauty of their shared environment. The lake remains pristine, the access road is well maintained, and property values have actually increased due to the community's reputation for environmental stewardship and cooperative governance. David's cabin has become something of a local landmark, not because it meets anyone's architectural standards, but because it represents the principles of individual property rights and standing up to bullying. The story of his confrontation with the HOA has spread throughout the county, and he occasionally receives calls from other property owners facing similar situations. His advice is always the same: know your rights, stay calm, and never let anyone intimidate you into giving up what is legally yours. Lake itself continues to provide David with the peace and solitude he originally sought. The early morning mist rising from the water, the sound of loons calling across the lake, and the sight of deer coming down to drink at dawn remind him daily why he chose this life. The wealthy homeowners around him have learned to appreciate these same simple pleasures, and the community has found a harmony that was impossible under Margaret Williams' authoritarian leadership. As David sits on his porch each evening, watching the sun set over Crystal Lake, he reflects on how a simple understanding of property law and a refusal to be bullied transform not just his own life, but an entire community. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or wealth, but with knowledge, patience, and an unwavering commitment to doing what is right. The lake that his great-grandfather created with vision and hard work continues to provide beauty and peace for everyone. He respects its power and treats it with the reverence it deserves.